"Can you take her instead of me?" whispered the little girl to the stranger. The cowboy said nothing, then bought them both. But what happens next will change everything. Comment below what you think happens next and hit subscribe, because this story will take you places you never saw coming. Texas, 1870. The livestock market buzzed with the sound of cattle and worse things that decent folks tried to ignore. The sun beat down merciless on wooden pens that held more than just animals. In the shadowed corners, women sat bound and broken, leftovers from a trade that turned people into property. Jake Dalton walked through that market like a man carrying ghosts. 37 years old, weathered by loss and hard living. 5 years back, he'd buried his wife, Sarah. 2 months later, their little girl, Emma, followed her mama to the grave. Since then, Jake lived alone on his ranch, working cattle and trying to outrun memories that followed him like shadows. He came to town for horse medicine, nothing more. But then tiny fingers tugged at his coat. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, stood barefoot in the dirt. Her dress was torn, her face sunburned, but her eyes held something that stopped Jake cold. The same look his Emma used to give him when she needed something important. "You don't have to take me," she whispered in broken English. "Just take my mama." She pointed to a woman slumped against a fence post, Maria Santos, maybe late 20s, her golden skin now pale with fever and dust. Her wrists were raw from rope, her face marked by cruel hands. She wasn't moving. "She ain't eaten in 2 days," the little girl said. "I gave her all my bread." Jake crouched down, slow, his knees creaking. "What's her name, sweetheart?" "Maria. She's my mama. They said if nobody buys her today, they'll take her somewhere real bad." Jake looked at that unconscious woman tied up like livestock. Then he looked at those big brown eyes staring up at him, and something stirred in his chest that had been dead for years. He stood up and walked to the slaver lounging nearby. Without a word, Jake pulled out his leather pouch and dumped gold coins on the table. "I'll take both," he said, simple as ordering coffee. The slaver's eyebrows shot up. "Both?" Jake nodded toward the child. "Girl comes too." The man leaned forward, counting the gold. "Well now, you just bought yourself a heap of trouble, cowboy." Jake looked down at the unconscious woman, then back at the little girl. "I've had worse." He lifted the child gentle, as handling newborn calves, settling her against his side. Then, careful as carrying precious cargo, he cut Maria down and carried her to his horse. Not a soul spoke as he rode away, but somewhere in the silence, the little girl whispered against his shirt, "Thank you for taking both." The ride to Jake's spread was long and quiet. His ranch sat tucked in a fold of cottonwoods, where nobody visited and nobody passed by, just how he'd wanted it until now. He carried Maria to the small bedroom that hadn't been used since Emma died. The walls were still pale blue, wooden toys sat on the windowsill, and a framed photo showed his daughter hugging a lamb, gap-toothed smile bright as sunshine. Jake laid Maria on the bed, gentle as laying down something sacred. The little girl, Rosie, she told him her name was Rosie, stood in the doorway, watching everything with wide eyes. "She's burning up," Rosie said softly. Jake nodded. "We'll get that fever down." For 2 days they worked together. Jake boiled willow bark tea, cleaned wounds, and wrapped torn wrists in clean cloth. Rosie climbed onto the bed and dabbed her mama's forehead with cool rags, whispering, "Mama, wake up, I'm here." Jake dozed in a chair by the door those nights, rifle across his lap, boots still on. He hadn't seen that room lit by candlelight in years. Now it glowed again with care, with hope, with the quiet hum of folks wanting to live. On the 3rd morning, Maria's eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, sharp and afraid. "It's all right," Jake said quiet as morning prayer. "You're safe now." Maria tried to sit up, gasped when pain shot through her ribs. Her eyes locked on Jake's, wild and ready to run even from a sickbed. "Where's Rosie?" she rasped, voice dry as desert sand. "Mama!" Rosie shot from the corner like a cannonball, wrapping her arms tight around Maria's neck. Maria gasped again, not from pain this time, but from relief so strong it shook them both. Her arms curled around her daughter, holding her like she'd never let go again. Jake backed away, giving them space. In the kitchen, He sat staring at his hands. Hands built for branding and fencing, not for doctoring and soup-making. But for 3 days, they'd done something different. And in the quiet beyond the wall, he heard sounds he hadn't heard in years. A mother's sob, a daughter's giggle. Something old inside him shifted. Not healed, not yet, but stirring. The sound of screaming shattered the morning quiet. Jake dropped his feed bucket and ran for the house, heart hammering like a war drum. The front door hung open like a wound. Inside, Maria stood wild-eyed and panting, a wooden hairbrush raised like a weapon. "Stay away," she shouted, voice thick with raw fear. "If you come near me, I swear—" Jake froze in the doorway, hands raised slow. "You're safe." But Maria couldn't hear him. Her whole body shook with a storm that had lived in her bones too long. She lunged, and the brush cracked against his shoulder, again and again, not trying to hurt him but fighting to not be helpless anymore. "You bought me!" she cried, voice breaking. "You think that gives you rights? That I'm yours now?" Jake didn't flinch, didn't defend himself. When her strength finally gave out and her arm dropped, Jake met her gaze and said one word: "No." Then he turned and walked out. Maria collapsed to her knees, shoulders shaking. It wasn't just fear gripping her, it was shame, confusion, the crushing weight of not knowing who to trust. Little Rosie stepped into the room barefoot, touched her mama's arm with gentleness that didn't belong on someone so young. "He sleeps on the floor," Rosie whispered. "Every night by the door. He never touches I see him." Maria blinked. For the first time, she noticed the folded blanket and pillow tucked near the doorframe, half hidden. Jake had never once entered without knocking. She'd thought it was because he didn't care. Now she realized it was because he did. Her gaze drifted to the small table by the lamp. A framed photograph sat there. A little girl with missing front teeth holding a lamb, beaming like the sun itself. Next to it, a carefully folded blanket embroidered with green thread. Emma. That night, Jake brought a tray of food. Maria didn't speak, but she nodded when he set it down. He didn't linger, just nodded back and closed the door gentle behind him. When she turned off the lamp that night, Maria didn't lock the door. She didn't feel like she had to. The next morning, light spilled across the windowsill as Maria watched Jake mend the eastern fence. His sleeves were rolled up, hands steady on his work. He didn't glance toward the house. No hunger in his gaze, no claim in his stance. Just a man who said he'd help and kept doing it. For the first time in years, Maria felt something unexpected move through her chest, the beginning of trust. The sun hung high when they came riding up, 3 men with dust trailing behind their horses like ghosts. The tall one in the leather coat dismounted first, followed by 2 others with rifles. Jake saw them coming. He walked out of the barn, wiping grease from his hands, saying nothing. "Name's Carter," the tall one said with a smirk. "We're here on business. Come to collect a girl named Maria. Got the papers right here." Jake glanced at the stained parchment, some crude forgery smeared with ink and arrogance. "I bought her," Jake said flat. "No." Carter stepped closer. "You bought time. She belongs to us now. Just hand her over and we'll be on our way." Jake's eyes flicked toward the porch where curtains barely shifted. Maria was watching. Rosie clung to her skirts. "Get off my land," Jake said. The second man sneered. "Or what?" Jake took another step forward. His hands were empty, but the tension in his body was like a loaded gun. "I paid gold for her," he said. "Now I'll pay blood if I must." Carter laughed. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Jake didn't answer. In one swift move, the man behind Carter reached for his rifle, but Jake was faster. He spun right, pulled a lever hidden behind the fence post. A shotgun fell into his hands from the hollow rail he'd carved himself. The blast ripped through the air. The second man went down screaming. The others scrambled. Carter drew and fired. The bullet tore across Jake's upper arm, blood blooming against his shirt. Maria screamed. Rosie cried out from inside. Jake dropped to one knee, cocked the shotgun again, and fired at their feet. "Next one takes your head off," he growled. That was all it took. They mounted fast, dragging their wounded partner, and fled into the horizon with dust in their eyes and death behind them. Jake stayed on one knee, blood dripping through his sleeve. Then the front door burst open and Maria rushed to him, dropping to the ground beside him. "You're bleeding," she whispered, hands shaking as she pressed them to his arm. Not too bad, he grunted. You're a fool, she said, tears streaking her cheeks. You could have been killed. I've been dead before, he said soft, when I lost Emma, but today I'm alive. She froze. Then without a word, she pressed cloth to the wound and wrapped his arm best she could. That stings, Jake winced. You deserve worse, she said, but her voice trembled. He looked at her. You didn't have to come out here. I did, she replied, meeting his eyes. Because you didn't have to fight for me, but you did. For the first time, Maria's hands didn't shake when she touched him. The kitchen smelled of blood and boiled cloth. Jake sat shirtless at the table, bullet wounds seeping, slow with each movement. His jaw was tight as stone, sweat on his brow, but he made no sound. Maria stood beside him with a kitchen knife and half-empty whiskey bottle. Her fingers trembled as she poured whiskey over cloth, then directly on the wound. You sure about this? Jake asked quiet. Maria nodded. I've seen worse. Had a brother back in Mexico who got into fights with boys twice his size, used to patch him up. She leaned closer, inspecting the damage. I need to cut a little, clean it out. Jake looked at the knife, then back at her. His eyes held no fear, only trust. You don't have to. I want to. Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither looked away. She tore linen into strips, rolled one tight, pressed it between his teeth. Bite. Jake obeyed. Her hands hovered just a moment. Then she lowered the blade. Jake's whole body tensed, a groan rumbling from his throat, but he stayed still. Maria's hands moved quick and sure, cutting away damaged flesh, dabbing with whiskey-soaked cloth, pressing clean gauze against the wounds. When it was over, she wrapped everything tight with practiced knots. Jake leaned back, eyes shut, chest slick with sweat. He spat out the cloth and breathed slow. You've done that before, he said. I told you about my brother. Silence fell between them, but different. This time, not cold or tense, just quiet. Maria glanced at the photo on the mantel. She looked like Rosie. Jake nodded. Emma, fever took her in 3 days. And your wife? Gone a month later. Couldn't live in a house without Emma's voice in it. Maria swallowed hard. Her eyes dropped to the table, to the empty space between them. Slowly, her hand rested there, open, not reaching, just waiting. She was lucky, Maria said soft. Jake frowned. How you figure? To be loved like that? Quiet stretched long. Then with careful purpose, Jake reached forward and placed his hand over hers. His fingers were rough and calloused, hers thin and worn from chains and labor, but they fit. She didn't pull away. Instead, she looked into his eyes, and for the first time since the cage, since the auction block, Maria didn't feel a man's gaze as something to fear. She felt it as something soft, something human, something she wanted to return. You should rest, she whispered, thumb brushing his knuckles, but neither moved. They just sat there, scarred, battered, stitched together not by duty but by choice, by something stronger than survival. The beginning of trust. Late afternoon sun stretched golden fingers across the plains as Jake walked beside the spotted mare. Rosie bounced in the saddle, little legs barely reaching the stirrups he'd adjusted just for her. Easy now, Jake said. Keep your hands steady. Rosie giggled, gripping the reins like it was the most important job in the world. Like this? Just like that? You're doing better than most grown folks. Pride lit up Rosie's face. Her cheeks were flushed from wind, hair wild around her temples. She looked down at him, smile bright as sunshine. Then something in her gaze shifted. She reached forward and wrapped her arms around Jake's neck. He caught her, lifting her from the saddle. She nestled into his chest, small hands curling into his shirt. Then she whispered, "Can I call you Papa now?" Jake's breath caught. He froze, arms tightening around her. The plains went silent. Even the mare turned her head like she was waiting for his answer. But Jake said nothing. His throat burned, his chest ached in corners he thought had gone numb, forever. So he just held her like the question didn't need words, held her like the answer had already been yes. From the fence line, Maria watched. She'd come out with fresh apples, ready to call them for supper. But she stopped when she saw Jake lifting Rosie from the horse, heard her daughter's voice small and hopeful. "Can I call you Papa now?" Maria couldn't breathe. And when she saw Jake's silence, saw how he just held Rosie with her face buried. In his wild curls, something broke and healed inside Maria's chest all at once. The apples fell from her hands. She sank to the ground, tears hot and quiet streaming down her face. She cried for all the nights Rosie had slept afraid, for all the mornings she'd woken without safety, for the months Maria had feared no man could be trusted. And here was this man, worn, weathered, silent, carrying her daughter like she was made of glass and gold. That night, after Rosie had fallen asleep, Maria stood at Jake's doorway. He sat by the window, lantern flickering across his face, fresh bandage on his shoulder. She stepped in without knocking. "She asked to call you Papa." Jake turned slow. "She did. I heard. I never heard her call anyone that before." Jake nodded, hand resting on his chair arm. Didn't know what to say. "You didn't need to," Maria said, voice catching. She walked closer, knelt beside him. "You brought her back to life." She paused, looked up at him. "Me too." Jake didn't speak. He just lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her fingertips like they were something sacred. The sun hung low over Texas, warm and golden, stretching shadows over the field of bluebonnets Jake had planted years ago for no reason until now. Wind whispered through tall grass, carrying the scent of spring and something new. By the old forge, Jake stood with sleeves rolled up, eyes steady on the small brass ring cooling in his palm. He'd made it from the firing pin of the revolver that saved Maria's life. Rough, not perfect, but honest and strong, just like the woman he'd made it for. When he walked back, Maria was brushing Rosie's hair outside. Her white dress fluttered in the breeze, simple, hand-stitched with effort not elegance, but it suited her more than any silk ever could. She turned when she saw him, and her breath caught. Jake approached slow. No crowd, no preacher yet. Just the three of them in a world they'd somehow survived. He didn't kneel, he didn't make speeches. He just held out the ring and said, voice, low and steady, "I lost everything once." He paused, eyes not leaving hers. "But you and Rosie, you gave me something to live for." Maria's hand trembled, taking the ring. Her fingers brushed his. She looked down at the brass, then at her wrist where rope scars still faintly marked her skin. Then she looked up and nodded. Yes. By afternoon, the field was dressed in petals. Miss Alberta, the town seamstress, had come with wildflower bouquets and fresh dresses. A few neighbors stood respectful distance away. Even the sheriff tipped his hat when he saw Jake's eyes and decided it was better to stay quiet. Rosie skipped ahead, scattering petals from a basket nearly her size. Her curls bounced, joy filling the air like music. Maria walked slow behind, her daughter holding prairie blossoms tied with twine. Her dress caught the sun, eyes bright, hands steady. The scar on her wrist was visible, so was the one on her collarbone, but she didn't hide them. There was nothing shameful in survival, and she was walking proof of it. At the altar, nothing more than 2 crates and a linen sheet, Jake waited in a button shirt, collar still stiff, hair combed for the first time in weeks. But it was his eyes that looked different, softer, lit from within. When Maria reached him, she whispered, "Never dreamed I'd wear white again." Right. Jake shook his head. "You earned it." The preacher said his words. Jake and Maria said theirs. The kiss was simple, sweet, and slow. 2 broken things finally whole. When they turned to walk back, Rosie ran up and grabbed both their hands. "Now we're all 3, she said, beaming. Jake looked at Maria, and Maria, head high, heart full, smiled through tears. "Yes, mi amor, all 3. The days after flowed quiet and full of breath. Maria burned eggs twice that first week, but Jake ate every bite without complaint. Rosie helped mash beans, proud with every stir. Evenings found them on the porch, Jake cleaning his rifle, Maria stitching dresses from leftover fabric, Rosie drawing pictures of their family under big yellow suns. They found their rhythm. Jake taught Rosie to saddle ponies. Maria mixed Spanish and English until words stuck. At church, Maria sat beside. Jake's scarred wrists no longer hidden. Nobody dared whisper. Not after what Jake had done. Not after the wedding under wildflowers. One afternoon, Maria opened a dusty trunk and found an old dress, Emma's, yellow and soft. She pressed it to her chest and wept. That evening, she gave it to Rosie, who twirled in fading light while Jake watched from the porch, eyes glassy. "You okay?" Maria asked, stepping beside him. For the first time in a long while, Jake nodded. "Yes." At night, Rosie would crawl between them and whisper, "I love you, Mama. I love you, Papa." And every time, Maria's eyes would blur, not from pain, but from joy that hurts when you've lived too long without it. They built new fences that fall, painted the barn, repaired broken swings. Jake carved a wooden plaque, Casa de Esperanza, House of Hope. Maria kissed him when he nailed it up. One crisp morning, as first frost kissed the fields, Maria stood at land's edge whispering prayers in Spanish. Gratitude, goodbye to fear, welcome to whatever came next. Jake wrapped arms around her waist, rested his chin on her shoulder. "Still scared?" She shook her head. "Not anymore." Inside, on the wall above the hearth, hung Rosie's latest drawing, a family of 3 with hearts over their chests. Below it, Maria had written in careful script, "Home." If this story stirred something in your chest, if you felt Jake's quiet strength, Rosie's fierce love, and Maria's journey from broken to whole, then you understand why we tell these tales. Real love doesn't always come with flowers. It comes with grit, grace, and someone willing to stand beside you when the world tries to tear you down. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in second chances, in families built by choice, not blood, and in the kind of love that rides through storms and stays. Because in a world full of noise, sometimes the most powerful stories are told in whispers.